Okay, the four amigos are riding again here. Hello, this is David Sloan Wilson, and with my great friends Tony Bigland, Steve Hayes, and Dennis Embry. Hello, gentlemen.
Good
Hello.
morning. Hello.
And we are here to celebrate the 10th anniversary of an article we wrote in the Behavioral and Brain Sciences called "Evolving the Future Towards a Science of Intentional Change." But we're not here to reminisce, not much anyhow. We'll begin with a little bit of reminiscing, but then quickly move to a future orientation. And I'd like to begin by just a quick round of how we came together and ended up after a number of years of working together. In fact, I just was going back, Tony, to find the first email that you sent me, and I didn't. My current email doesn't go back that far, but our emails starting from 2010, we have written 4,784 emails to each other. I just wanted you to uh, to to know that. So I'll kick off how we came together. I was just starting to use my evolutionary framework in my city of Binghamton, in other words, to do applied work. And as I was doing this, feeling kind of um, I should say, you know, falsely confident. I got an email from you. You had read Darwin's Cathedral, and you had contacted me to invite me to a symposium at your Society for Prevention Research. And so I wrote you back, of course, accepting your invitation and then telling you a little bit about what I was doing. And you wrote an email back that was saying, "Oh boy, do you need me? This is what I do." And through you, I began to discover
Hmm.
this wonderful, wonderful world of applied behavioral science. We now we call it contextual behavioral science, of just amazing work of what really was cultural evolution, but not by that name. And then it was you who introduced me to Stephen Dennis. So I'm going to pass the baton to you, Tony, and then we could, as the next person, to describe from your perspective how we came together.
Well, I think I became oriented towards evolution pretty early on. Um, I read the Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and then I started reading Skinner. And I was an anti-Skinner person. I was in the I was on the board of the ACLU, and I can remember wishing that uh, Skinner would die before he did more harm. And then I started reading it and realized that the structure of scientific evolution was talking about paradigms, and that Skinner was proposing a paradigm that said that we could understand every aspect of behavior in terms of the constructs that he was using. So I got into it that way, and at the same time, I was transforming from a social psychologist. I was trained in social psychology into clinical psychology, and was reading Skinner. And I spent a year at the University of Wisconsin on an internship and got to know um, um, Dave. I can't remember his name. He was my mentor there, and Steve knew him because he moved on to Rhode Island, and that was help me. Um, can't do it. But anyway, um, so then I got a, a draft of uh, a chapter from this guy Steve Hayes. I'd never
Hmm.
heard of him. He mailed it to me. I don't know why how he had even had my mailing address. And I started reading that, and it described people who I had worked with that I hadn't been successful with. We'd started a behavior therapy clinic. So I started following him and learning as much as I could, and was very much influenced by Steve's work. And at one point, Steve said that, we should get people in other sciences who were into this contextual approach. And I remembered that after I got to know you and said, hey, you should you guys should be connected because of that, and that turned out to be the case. And Dennis, I met at a presentation he made at the University of Oregon where he was talking about community builders, and that I started following because what I've always done is been interested in things that really seem to be working and were consistent with my, conceptual approach. And what Dennis was doing influenced community work that we were doing in Cottage Grove. We created community builders. And so that's sort of the background. Let me say one other thing. When I became a behavior therapist and I went to the University of Wisconsin on an internship, I I thought my task was to teach everyone to be a behaviorist. And I was excited about that. And now I have to remember this, Dave. It's so sad I can't remember this. I just turned 80. This is what you get when you turn 80 and you freeze up in these circumstances. So I'll remember it at some point. But he said, no, that was mistaken. And he certainly would be consistent with our thinking conceptually. But what he said is my job was to help clients achieve their goals. And it wasn't to teach them to be behavior analysts. And that came to mind when we were talking the other day about what we're doing here. And what we're doing here is using these concepts and creating systems that are making a difference and that are working. But I don't think that everybody has to become an evolutionist in any sort of formal sense in order to help achieve the kinds of outcomes we're trying to achieve, which are essentially, in my view, the fundamental thing is that everyone should live a long, healthy, and productive life in caring relationships with other people, and that we're trying to increase the prevalence of that. And so there were because I started thinking one of the possibilities would be to identify all the organizations that are consistent with what we're thinking about. And there are so many of them. Or is it only the 80 that would be that you would find who are focused on this evolutionary theory? And so I think it would be fruitful to have further discussion about that.
We will.
Just one example is Doug Carnine, who's created this kindness foundation. He's an empiricist. He'd certainly be consistent, accept our evolutionary account, but he's been teaching kindness in schools. So I'll shut up, and I'm sorry I went too long, but there we are.
Steve, why don't you go next?
Well, I don't remember exactly why I reached out to Tony other than, the journey I've been on is I've sort of thought of myself as trying to carry forward, just to sort of carry water for what Skinner was doing. I got interested in Skinner, oddly, through Maslow and wanting to help people live more successful lives in a positive way, but then despaired that his approach to science wasn't going to work, and saw in Walden 2 that vision that you could go from high precision, high scope principles with infrahumans and with the rats and pigeons and maybe scale it all the way up to how to raise your kids. And I thought, well, that's just really cool. Could you do that? And, Skinner extended these things out into community intervention. So I think that's why I reached out to Tony, who was just seeing these kind of cool behavioral extensions into the community. But then when the contact was made with you, David, I've told the story many times and I'll repeat it in a short version, but, I literally wept when you took the behaviorists seriously. Your early writings were sort of treating it as black boxers, which is what people were told to think. Skinner's dying words went on variation and selection and evolution and three ways and how important that may be. But at the time, evolutionary thinking had taken a hard turn towards, kind of the blind watchmaker. We're part of the life cycle of genes, period, end of story. And, modern synthesis kind of considered in a very narrow way, I think. And that was almost laughed at by evolutionists or their representatives in psychology, people like Marty Seligman. And so, not to criticize Marty and all that he does, but he definitely did there. So I was really excited to find that there was somebody who might be thinking about evolutionary science. And I hesitated over the word science because at the time, my evolutionary science training was minimal. I mean, I was reading kind of at a very high level, but then kind of not really relating to Dawkins and some of those things like that. I have a hard time understanding that, why that would be the only part of it, and not finding much in evolutionary science that I could bite into. So I needed a mentor to help me out. I mean, I was literally writing articles about evolutionary thinking without really being trained in evolutionary thinking properly. And so I very soon ended up being a mentee of one David Sloan Wilson. Followed him around like a puppy dog, and asked him for things to read, and tried my best to understand them. And it's changed my life profoundly. But not in a way that has eliminated that early idea of let's do high precision, high scope principles, but scale them. But to do it, I think it's a lot better to think of psychology as part of the larger life sciences under the umbrella of evolutionary science. It just makes a whole lot more sense. Not the way traditional evolutionary psychology is thought about it. I just don't think that is a good way to think about it. Back to too much focus on the paleo period and what.
I'll say a bit about that shortly. Yeah.
So that was how I got looped in, and then boy, it became a central focus of my work and still is, and has matured. But it was a wonderful connection, and this article I think expresses some of where we tried to take it in terms of creating a science of intentional change that is built around evolving on purpose in a multidimensional, multi-level way.
Wow, that's great. Dennis, you're next, and then I'm going to take us for our next cycle.
So I was thinking about this. My entree into science and evolutionary theory was at age 14. When I did my first randomized control group study, I'd won a $100 scholarship from a National Science Foundation junior fellow, for whatever that was, somewhere back in time. That's about the way I remember it. And what I was wanting to do was to find out the effects of astronauts going into outer space and genetic change. So obviously I could not purchase rockets into space and cosmonauts or astronauts. So I chose another subject, which were fruit flies. And I created artificial magnetic spheres around my fruit flies in a randomized control group trial. And then what I was looking for were the rates of mutation in eyes in the flies. And that was a rather precocious thing for an 8th grader.
Yeah.
And since I was able to show that with the fruit flies, and then I got more money to do it with mice, and rats. But the problem was they ate each other. So I never got to that part of the exercise. So I've been involved in thinking about evolutionary theory, human force for change. That was much of my undergraduate degree. And then I landed at Kansas again with Don Baer as my advisor. And what I was wanting to do was were population level strategies. Practically no one had done that at ABA. And I took a particular project, which was the 3rd leading cause of death of young children, which was children going out into the street in the course of play. and I got money from the American Automobile Foundation, and I was also then working with Sesame Street because one of my advisors was one of the key people who designed the developmental ideas and notions for Sesame Street. And the results were quite powerful, and I got a chance to do the Safe Playing Project in New Zealand, which of all places had the highest pedestrian accident of young children in the Commonwealth, in the rich countries. And you would think, New Zealand? Why? Why would that? Well, they had an ecological variable, which both Australia and New Zealand, particularly New Zealand, has front yard fences right up to the sidewalk. And so the narrow space is about this for the tarmac or bricks or concrete, and then there's a little bit of grass like this. And of course, that's where the kids were playing and interacting. And what we did was reinforce children for not going into the street. And it was very powerful. And I spread the ideas, and that came to me as something, this is really an important principle, is that humans and I suspect most mobile organisms have a sense of a brake, a gas pedal, and a steering wheel. And we were able to then translate that to the good behavior game. And now we've made that as a population level strategy in multiple countries and here in the United States at a large scale. And what I'm hoping to do now is we're interfacing with Salesforce, so that Salesforce runs all of the databases practically in the world. And so what I'm looking at, hopefully, we will be able to see population level impact as we do these larger and larger and larger scaling up of the good behavior game.
Yeah, that's so great. And there's so much to cover. I'm trying to think about our conversation in the context of those who might be listening to it. And but I think what we encountered when we started to work together was this amazing crazy quilt of different disciplines that were disconnected from each other. I mean, we had the history of behaviorism in psychology and what they called the cognitive revolution, and then we had something called evolutionary psychology, and it's setting itself apart from something called the standard social science model, in which Skinner was put into that bucket, and so a real disconnect between the basic behavioral sciences and the applied behavioral sciences, and all of them really disconnected from evolution, which at that time was mostly confined to genetic evolution. And so I often use the phrase archipelago of knowledge and practice, many islands with little communication among islands. And so the purpose of our VBS paper was, first of all, to attempt some kind of conceptual unification, so that this all could be under the big umbrella of evolutionary science. The famous phrase, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution, could be stretched beyond biology, as most people understand it, to all things human, which of course should be biological, but by that we don't mean genetic. And then to call attention to the amazing work in the behavioral sciences, which were hiding in plain sight. We call them diamonds in the sand. And the idea that the evidence is all around us, but we're not seeing it by virtue of how we're thinking about it. And so that was the other main objective of the article, was to bring these amazing examples from individuals to populations of successful intentional change. And so that was what the article was about. And now it's 10 years later, and I think we really do want to get to the future oriented part of our conversation. And so these two things, conceptual integration and practical application, I think, I'll go last in the sequence as to how far have we come at conceptual integration and practical application, and how can we go even faster into the future? And Dennis, why don't you begin by telling more about the good behavior game? Because most of our listeners won't even know what it is. This is part of the problem, and how you've actually developed that from a very small program to something that's being applied internationally.
So it was first tested in a little town outside of Lawrence, Kansas. And there are 300 people in there, and there was an elementary school and a first year teacher whose classroom was difficult. And she was ready to quit. And her husband happened to be studying at the University of Kansas in the Department of Human Development and Family Life. And she came in with her husband and to Montrose Wolf, who was one of the founders of applied behavior analysis. And so they were talking, and Mont suggested maybe we should reinforce the kids for not doing something, for inhibiting an unwanted behavior, unwanted behaviors. And that was a novel concept at the time, because if you're trying to just reinforce good behavior, you were not going to be able to get rid of this constant stream of problematic behaviors. So the game was set up that if the kids were playing in teams and they rotated, so they had to learn to work with each other, and they were allowed to have, like a basketball game or a football game, you could have so many outs or outfielders or whatever. I'm not a great sports person, other than I love to run. And so that made sense to me. And it really, really worked. And then my colleagues at Johns Hopkins, which I didn't know at the time at all, had picked up the good behavior game and done several amazing 3-term randomized trials to show positive outcomes. So we had general, the school as usual. There was a special educational activity, and then there was the good behavior game. And the good behavior game swamped everything. The effects were positive for reading, writing, all those kinds of things, plus reducing problematic behavior. And then it turned out over time, there was major impact on social emotional competencies, and the kids got more money when they were in adulthood, and they were less likely to go to jail. They were less likely to have unwanted children, etc. And when I learned that, I decided I'm going to make that something that can be in every community and school in the world.
Dennis, let me just break in and say what the good behavior game is first of all, the kids nominate what it means to be good.
Yes.
Number two, they're formed into groups. And then the groups do their schoolwork and they compete to be good. So if they manage to keep their misbehaviors down below a minimum, they get very small rewards. And so basically what you've set up is, first of all, a group level competition, basically, to reinforce good behaviors. And the Baltimore study showed that followed these kids into adulthood, basically, and showed lifelong effects, basically, of playing the good behavior game. And now this is what you're expanding.
Yes. Yes.
I want to mention something here about that. This was clearly driven by evolutionary thinking, because the entire program at Kansas was based on Skinner's work, which, as we've been pointing out, is evolutionarily organized.
Yeah.
But it took a psychiatrist who believed in doing randomized trials to actually put it on the map, and in fact to influence Dennis to start working on it and so on. I introduced him to Shep Kellum, the guy who did the randomized trials. But the whole field of prevention science has got so focused on randomized trials, and I keep talking to both sides of this, the people so fixated on randomized trials and the people who are in contingency management, because it was individuals and the level of and individual groups at multi-level selection that was involved in this. But to a great extent, the prevention scientists lost track of the focus on individuals as the root of the successes of all these randomized trials. And I have been hectoring behavior analysts about that ever since.
Well, that's a great segue to Steve. I have a feeling that you would like to say something on that topic.
Well, I actually hadn't. Yes, I was very interested because I kind of see that and what Steve is doing now a little better.
Yeah, well, you know, I really came in to my work trying to overcome two things that I saw in Skinner that I thought needed to be worked on. One is he didn't figure out a way to make friends, and the evolutionary science was
Yes,
especially sad.
Yeah.
The man dies walking about evolution, and he's used as the archetype of the, you know, the social science model that is anti-evolution, or, you know, with Marty Seligman, it's the archetype of an you know, the first study Skinner ever did was on tropism in ants. I mean, he said, but somehow or another wound up over there. So that was one. But the bigger one for me was I didn't think that he had handled language and cognition properly. And I tried to apply what he'd done clinically, couldn't do it. Every time I dug in hard, it ended up I should do the study with rats or pigeons, which I did as a clinical psychology professor, and then heard him give a talk where he said he didn't think it would ever turn into a research program because it was an exercise in interpretation. And I went up in my hotel room and ripped my shirt and said, "That's it. I am not given any more." And but when I finally saw a way, due to a colleague, Aaron Brownstein, to think of the development of relating as an operant process that then, based in cooperation, that's something that comes from our work, David. The cooperation came first, I believe, as an extension of cooperation. And then I did basic studies on that and then realized that it could be scaled into human psychology. So I've been on a 40-year journey, including some personal experiences I've talked about, from 1981 to now. And where we are right now, you know, as it got going and we did that very small n studies, very basic studies on language and cognition, trying to develop high precision, high scope principles that could scale into human complexity. From that 81 to the first book is 20 years. From the first book to now, where we have 1,200 randomized controlled trials up and another 200 to put up, so we'll be close to 1,400 within about 2 months.
That's not enough.
It's around the world. It's distributed by the World Health Organization right now in the Ukraine and in Uganda and in Turkey and so forth with refugees, and does some really kind of cool, amazing things that appear to be long lasting. And it's built on the evolutionary thinking of Skinner, but then as extended by what I've learned from you, David. But all of that isn't really what the game was, really, to me, because in China, you speak Chinese, you know, randomized controlled trials fuzz the individuals and the individual families and couples and systems and organizations as well. And that's a place where I'm going now. But really, the journey that's in this article and that's in the cooperation here that has excited me is repairing that mistake. I think I'll say it as a mistake that Skinner made around verbal behavior, which will take you to a mental age of 2 to 3, and then it stops, and be able to take it all the way up into what we're doing right now. It's given us a chance to get back in the game, but I'm really not interested so much in just ACT or behavior analysis or whatever. The game is to get these high precision, high scope, high depth principles into human culture in a way that betters people's lives. And I think the umbrella of evolutionary science is the way to do it. But it can't be the genes made me do it, blind watchmaker kind of stuff. That just won't scale, and it has some creepy implications. So this article was kind of a statement of, here's where we are, put a peg in the ground. here's where we're going. And if we could change the conversation in all of these areas where evolutionary thinking applies, which is everywhere that human beings go, maybe we could bend the arc more quickly towards a world in which each human life is empowered as best we can with the resources that we have.
Well, Steve, look, can I ask you a question here?
And we'll pass to you, Tony. As if you're going through cycles, then
Yeah.
let's go ahead and take your turn, then I'll
Well,
take mine, and we'll go on another cycle.
My question is, of the 1,200 randomized trials, I'm thinking about this from the standpoint of multi-level selection. How many of those are ones where you were where what's getting selected is a group activity as opposed to the individual well-being?
40% involve group methods. Something like 45% are in lower and middle income countries. Only 21% are focused on the DSM and things like that. 42% are focused on behavioral health, dealing with disease and things of that kind. And then the rest are in social justice and wellness. So I tried to build it in a way that it was not a psychotherapy. It was not it was a set of principles integrated in the way I was talking about that would go around the world. And in fact, that's happened, I think, arguably more than any other example you can pick at least in the psychotherapy domain.
Well, I'm unclear. The kind of thing I have in mind is the selection of the practices of corporations where the contingency is between what they do and their profits. And that's selected a set of practices of corporations, many of which are harmful, but it's selection at the group level. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yes, and you may know that my biggest effort in that area has been to work with this other gentleman here on pro-social and to try to combine principles at the level of the individual, couple, family, small groups up to principles that started at that level with Lynn Ostrom's core design principles. But if you'd said how many things are oriented towards, well, I don't know, I mean, organizing workers, that was Bond and Bunce 2000, one of the very first, is the fourth randomized trial ever done. And from 2000 to now, we got 1,200 going up. And there's quite a number of examples like that. But it's a specifically psychological theory, and psychology is a whole organism interacting in with the context considered historically and situationally. And it's part of a multi-level system of the social, cultural, and the biophysiological dimensions. So
Yeah.
I don't think it should be held to account only at that social level.
I wasn't criticizing. I'm just trying to understand that.
Tony, I'd love you to talk a little bit about how you followed your book on the nurture effect with a book on capitalism. I think that applying these ideas basically to such things as capitalism, corporations, and their motivation and their reinforcers, basically. Could you say a bit about that? Because that's one of the directions that you've taken it in that I think would be lovely for our audience to know.
Yeah, I actually published a paper with Sigrid Glenn in one of the many behavior analytic papers that no one has ever read. It just struck me that groups, corporations. Well, look at the evolution of corporations. Corporations evolved in society starting about 1800 because it was a way of organizing a set of people that worked better than just the individual person. And what has happened over the last 50 years is that the advocacy for free market economics, which seems to be eroding, by the way, among the Republicans, that advocacy said, Milton Friedman said, the only job of a corporation is to maximize its profits. And they have followed that. And in following that, they have selected practices which very often are profitable, even though they harm the people that they are marketing to. And tobacco, alcohol, and unhealthful food are wonderful examples of that. So I think about all of these things in terms of the selection by consequences of the practices of large organizations. And something that we need to change, which I'm trying to do. So
Yeah, so I think that that's the fundamental. Um, uh, I kind of classify the generalized Darwinism, which is what we're talking about, as having two major components. One is dual inheritance theory, the idea that our meaning systems are the cultural equivalent of our genes. And so we can think of our cultures as inheritance systems. And so that requires us to think a lot about the interior, basically, the inner aspects of the way we think and feel. That's where therapeutic traditions come in, act, and all of that, all of which influence the way we act. So dual inheritance theory is a huge part of this. The other huge part is multi-level selection theory, and which of course has a very complicated history within biology. I mean, was heretical within the biological sciences, but the simple logic of multi-level selection theory I describe as like a perverse alchemist who turns gold into lead, so that cooperation at one scale actually can easily become disruptive at higher scales. And it's there that you get the perversion of, self-interest becomes self-dealing, helping kith and kin becomes cronyism and nepotism. My corporation first becomes a dysfunctional economy. Growing the economy becomes overheating the earth. My nation first becomes international conflict. And it's there where you get the shareholder value model as being maximizing profits for a shareholder. It does not, it basically shows that the invisible hand metaphor is profoundly false. And so these ideas at the most elementary level, which of course is the most important level, are profoundly important. I mean, if you don't get the basic logic of multi-level selection theory, you just can't get started with almost any policy issue. And it's as relevant to the psychological domain as the economic domain. There's no domain, no topic area that doesn't need these concepts. And what I feel has happened, because that's what we tried to get across in our BBS paper, I feel my own assessment about where we stand now is it's the proverbial glass part full and part empty. I feel that in 10 years, the whole narrative about the paradigm has matured, you might say. And so it's much easier to describe. And problems that we addressed in the BBS paper, especially this disconnect between the Skinnerian view and the evolutionary psychology view, and how they really we should be thinking about them as like the innate and the adaptive component of the immune system. I've been having recently reread our BBS article. There's a whole section there about how do we take these things that have been pulled apart and put them back together. And we did a pretty good job in that article. I'm not saying that that's the article per se that is responsible for the progress, but 10 years in, and there's a much more coherent view on the open-ended nature of cultural evolution and also a rich innate nature. Figures like Joe Henrich and Michael Muthakrishna, just to pick two major figures, Richard McElreath, just a few major figures that have contributed to this. So that's the glass part full. The glass part empty is that the whole world still needs to know about this. So this is like, a fairly large number of people who get it that are still the tiniest of fractions of the people who need to get it. And Steve, just hours before this interview, you did some quick Google Scholar searches, and you showed that applied evolutionary science on Google Scholar got 79 hits.
Yeah.
And so that's
half of them are from us, right?
How far we need to go. And part of this is because the competing narratives. And so and that brings us right back to dual inheritance theory and the concept of symbotypes. That's a word that we coined in our BBS article. They're very powerful symbotypes that are out there, and more than one of them. So one of them is the neoclassical paradigm, of course. And if that's what's in your head, then you'll be blind to all kinds of stuff will be hiding in plain sight. if Milton Friedman is lurking inside your head. But then in addition, Steve, just a couple days ago, when we met in preparation for this talk, you were saying that psychology is this huge narrative that is standing in the way. So that if you have certain conceptions of psychology in your head, you'll also be blind to things that are hiding in plain sight. And I wonder if you could elaborate on that a little bit
Maybe a
about what.
quick example that rolls off the one you're talking about. If something that's good at this level doesn't work at this level, and at this level, if you're not looking for it, you know, if you look at all of our psychological concepts, almost all of them are built around psychometrics as a way of measuring and refining the concept, randomized controlled trials as a way of testing the applied implications of it. Those two steps blur the levels of analysis in such a way that you simply cannot be aware. It is impossible to be aware of what has been found and what it means. You take psychometrics, there's a latent construct that is built up, the true score, based on variability between people. What is that unit that's evolving? It doesn't exist. It's an abstraction. The variability is within organisms over time and groups of organisms. And when you start modeling that, and this is what I've been doing more recently, you're shocked that almost any concept we can name falls apart. It just doesn't work. Take randomized controlled trials, same thing. You have some change in a central tendency, measured against what? Differences between people. That's where the error term is constructed. What is that? It's an abstraction. What happens if you look at variation within the person over time? It's a different perspective. So let me give you a applied example that fits what you're talking about in psychology, and one that's close to my work and I feel good about. Compassion, self-compassion. If you're kind to yourself, you'll be kinder to others. Well, that's true. Correlation is about 0.4, replicated over and over and over and over and over again. Now we start looking instead within the person over time and how it then extends to the couples and families that people are part of. And you measure it at those multiple levels. And it turns out that about 1 out of 10 people, the nicer they are to themselves, the meaner and nastier they are to others. And if you put it through all the stats, if you put it through psychometrics, you put it through randomized trials, it completely disappears, completely disappears. And in fact, some of the stats actually end up with forcing a distribution together that eliminates the outliers, eliminates those 1 out of 10, so that you, in multi-level multi-level measurement, for example, statistically, if you dig into the stats as to what's going on there, it's modeling the individual. No, it isn't. It's modeling the individual to find the one true model that puts all the individuals together. And the way you do that is you throw out the exceptions. And so we've been lying to ourselves and to the entire world, driven by a biostatistical model that doesn't fit an evolutionary model. And the effect of that is the entire world is thinking in terms of bell curves and standard deviations, and 8-year-olds know what their percentile rank is, God help us, and think that predicts their future, and it doesn't. And it's shocking how little of psychology will survive if you really take this seriously. And there's a few in neurodevelopmental and behavior analysis. That's about it. The
So
few.
Steve, to take it seriously means, if I just to play it back, that every individual person is a complex evolving system. And so therefore you need to treat the individual as a unit of analysis. And the only way you can do that by gathering longitudinal data on them. And only then can you aggregate. Only then can you aggregate. So that's the way I would put it. Is that accurate?
Exactly. And the same is true of couples. We know that couples are the same way. Each couple is individual. We know that that's true of families. It's true of organizations. It's true of neighborhoods. It's so this kindness turning into selfishness example that I used, you can go down into the suborganismic level as well. The kind of precision medicine that we need to deal with cancer and so forth is going to have to be longitudinal, and it has to be respectful of the unit that you're looking at, nested in units. And we've been blurring it so badly by the biostatisticians, all of whom, by the way, were driven by evolutionary ideas, and almost all of the early ones were eugenicists. They were built the stats to categorize people, not to empower people.
So Steve, let me ask you a question about that. Am I correct that what you're trying to do, and I think about this in terms of the hexaflex, that you're trying to identify patterns of relationships among those 6 features that are the same, that may be the same across a set of people. And once you're at that level, you can do randomized trials with people who are the same with respect to those relations. Is that?
Well, I think it's a mistake
about
not to include measures of the social cultural level. So those are now in our models, and at the biophysiological level, those are in our models as well. So you really need, you could dimensionalize the psychology though, and you look over time. But what we're finding is on those 6, and boy, if you want to be embarrassed about your previous work, do what I'm talking about methodologically, because every psychological concept is wrong. All those 6 fall apart as sort of simple things where you say that's good. No, sometimes it's not. It depends. It depends on the situation and how it all links, and that you need to know that to be able to do anything about it. That sometimes, for example, people focus on their values and get overwhelmed by the emotions they feel as a result, and they end up going backwards, not forwards. Don't be saying values clarity is good for everybody. It's not true. It depends on context in a multi-level, multi-dimensional way, considered over time and measured and analyzed the proper way. So I'm breathing in and breathing out and realizing what a heavy lift we've got because we've now socialized the world in the name of evolutionary thinking. I mean, Galton was an evolutionist of a sort, Erasmus Darwin was his grandfather, and
Ronald Fisher.
All the rest are R.A. Fisher and the rest. So we're going to have to unpack undo. When people say people haven't listened to psychology, yes, they have. That's the problem. The entire world listened to bad psychology driven by racist.
Well, I mean, what you just said for individuals definitely goes for organizations, and what we're doing now, including a conversation I had prior to this one, is if you want to understand an organization, you got to take a deep dive into that organization. They're an entity. They're an evolving unit, a super individual unit, and we know about Tinbergen's 4 questions: history, development, mechanism, function. And then every organization has its history, if it works well, then it's by certain mechanisms, and those mechanisms are different than another organization. And this is really truly evolutionary at the end of the day, because what does a biologist do but treat each species, and actually each population of each species, as its own unit that has responded to selection pressures and so on and so forth. So there's this contrast between generality on one end, nothing makes sense except in the light of, and extreme specificity on the other end. Every entity a product of evolution that has to be understood in its own terms, and that's what we're applying to the individual person or to organizations at all scales, because the national scale would the same statements would hold. And so this amazing combination of generality and specificity, I think, is at the end of the day what should be considered evolutionary.
I very much agree with that.
Well, let's have a final round as to where we want to go in the future. And actually, I'm going to claim the first one, if I could, because I want to go back to something that Tony, you said at the beginning, is that we don't have to insist that everybody think about this in an evolutionary way. And then you listed a great program on kindness. that doesn't necessarily think about it in an evolutionary way, but you might say it has converged. And I feel that I want to say, first, I want to agree with you in part, but what we find for any particular topic domain, it might be education, it might be economics or business or anything at all, is what Eleanor Ostrom found for a certain kind of group, common pool resource groups, that in the first place, they varied in how well they functioned, how well they performed. And the high performers employed certain core design principles that she was able to derive thanks to the fact that they did vary. And what we can generalize around that is that in any domain, we will find when we look at groups or individuals, we will find, excuse me for using the term, a distribution. There'll be a distribution. And the high performers will have converged upon certain general principles. This is like convergent cultural evolution. And although it's great that they've converged and we can learn a lot from the success stories, they're all around us, hiding in plain sight. The fact that they're not understood in general terms is still a handicap. And so it's very, very important, I think, at the end of the day, for there to be this general conceptual understanding to explain the full distribution, including the success stories. And Tony, maybe I'll just pass to you so you can comment on that, and also comment more generally on where we, in our final round, on where we can go in the future and how we can catalyze. I love that word, catalysis. The idea that rates of cultural evolution can be catalyzed just like rates of chemical reactions. Then how can we catalyze this conscious intentional change?
Well, I wonder if my thinking, I see how you think about this. The strategy that I have in mind, the paper that we published in medium.com articulates the way in which profit maximization has corrupted all different kinds of organizations. And then we now have a paper that focused specifically on the healthcare system and the way in which maximization of the profits of pharmaceutical companies have produced addiction and drug overdoses. The maximization of profits in the insurance companies have led to health insurance companies whose profits are significantly higher than the average corporate profits, but the people they're insuring are being harmed because they're not allowed to do this or that or the other thing. The huge disparities in health are also in part a function of the fact that we simply have a much larger proportion of the population that's living in poverty. And the corporations didn't set out to affect that, but they set out to reduce union organizing. They set out to reduce to keep the minimum wage where it is, to do everything to minimize the income of the lower people. And you see that in the ratios of the wealth of, we got over 40 years, the ratio of the salaries of the leaders of these corporations, you know all that stuff. But all of that evolved because it was working for the wealthy people who were putting the money into promoting the public policies and the widespread beliefs that enabled them to focus strictly on profit maximization. So what I want to do is to go into every sector of society and show the ways in which this kind of profit maximization competes against values having to do with ensuring the well-being of every person. So, which comes back to what you've been talking about for a long time, David, that it's self-aggrandizement versus the the well-being of others. I don't know how that fits with what you're saying. I'd be interested in
Oh,
your-
it fits perfectly. Values based, and also the necessity of values based as opposed to material gain based. Yeah. So Dennis, you could go next. How do we catalyze? What's in
Well,
the future? How do we catalyze it?
I'm listening to the three of you, and there's a pessimistic notion that we have about the future of our species in some ways. And I'm working at this basic level of population level development for young children to work collaboratively and cooperatively and maximize their individual skills, which can also then interact with other people's skills. So I was just thinking about this as cultural evolution. So our kids, when they're doing the PAX Good Behavior game, and this is a little different than the sort of more behavior analytic versions of the good behavior game. So this is much more flexible in real life in communities. So the children are always predicting, monitoring, and reflecting of what's happening in their classrooms. That's part of the bargain. And they do that collectively. And then they're asked to make predictions for the next iteration of the day or event. And that helps them create a more solid, fluid, and effective social generalization. And we see this over a long time in our Hopkins studies. We see that the young people who've had this are doing much, much better at age 35, 45, and their kids are better. And that's extraordinary. And this mechanism of the good behavior game in its full-blown right that we've fleshed it out. So they're always active agents of change, and humans need to have the ability to activate their future changes and have some power and capacity to do that. And it's quite lovely to watch this with kids. And I realize this, that in some ways, I had those skills when I was a young boy. Partly because my parents were not very good at managing me. And so I sought out other people who were smart, and I wanted to know everything that they were knowing. I was a vacuum cleaner for knowledge and skills and things. And imagine that if we do that for a lot of kids, that the good behavior game is not rules. It's about outcomes that the young people want. It's not telling them what to do, what not to do. The children are in fact deciding. And they
Well, I want to showcase something. Forgive me for butting in, but something that in the case of the good behavior game that's so extraordinary. You do an intervention that lasts a year, and you'd think that there might be an improvement then, but then what happens next? There's no intervention, and so you'd think they'd just go back to their previous state, but they don't. And so there's many studies, and Steve, you have the commanding knowledge of all these RCTs. When we compare pre, post, and follow-up, of course, you hope for there to be a difference between pre and post, but what you also get is a further improvement between post and follow-up. Now, what does that mean? That means that you actually did something permanent, which then got further built upon without any intervention at all. And how often is it that we get that amazing double benefit, but first between pre and post, which you hope for, of course,
Right.
but then between post and follow-up, further improvement. That's a real sign that you've done something in terms of permanent changing the evolutionary trajectory.
And change in BDNF gene expression.
And it goes back with epigenetics and all of that. Of course, that's back to the kind of the innate component of the system. All of this is mediated through genes, ultimately through genes. It's not as if we're forgetting about them, but and the whole physiological organism. But Steve, how often is it that we get this double benefit?
Quite regularly, but it actually, if you look at it properly, what I would say now is properly almost every time, and here's why. When you look at these arbitrary collectives that we've been using to sort of figure out what the processes of change on that will stick and stay in our randomized trials and our psychometrically pure evaluations and so forth. What we're hiding are variables that we had to invent a name for it in this whole stat approach I'm talking about. We had to invent a name for that too. You know, I always point out the word normal wasn't in the English language and regularly used until about the 1840s, and it was built by the 1860s. And the eugenicists who spread it, not the folks in geometry where it started. We don't have a name for we call it idionomic, of focusing on the individual and then how you can get nomothetic principles from it. We don't have a name for variables that disappear in importance, but when you look at a different level of analysis, end up being really important, but sometimes in both directions, depending on their context. We call them equisyncratic. That's our latest neologism. But so let's take a randomized trial, let's say one I'm a little bit proud of, one of the first to show that in a war zone, when people have not developed yet a mental health disorder, whatever that is, another bad idea that we put into the culture, you can get a 50% reduction of whether or not they will later develop that by bringing people together in a group, looking at a cartoon book and listening to an audio tape played by health workers who often have only an elementary school education. This is an Araturk et al. It's the WHO prevention trial using the most downloaded document on the entire WHO website, which is an ACT self-help book called Doing What Matters in Times of Stress. But if you instead just looking at the follow-up and whether it's stuck, you look individually, you'll find that some people got worse, some people got better, some people continued to improve, some people improved and fell apart. And if you model them as individuals, then it's, and as couples and as organizations at all levels, that way, longitudinally, which now we can do with AI, now we can do with longitudinal measures. It turns out lying in plain sight are entire subgroups of people who respond to our approaches in different ways, good, bad, and indifferent. So the message that my kind of takeaway message is that we've had false starts over and over again in the life sciences. We do have that famous quote, nothing makes sense except in light of evolution, but we've had major false starts in evolution.
That's a great point to make. Thank you for making that point, Steve.
Eugenics is a really clear example. One out of 67% of the presidents of the APA from 1892 to 1947 were card-carrying eugenicists. It's washed away. We don't see it. We don't hear it. It's not there. Of course, it was there. And that same is true in biology and so forth. That's just an example. But then there's another one. How did it happen that we ended up saying genes are the only thing that mattered in evolution? How did that happen? Evolutionary science has to look at that. Why did that happen that way? Yes, we have to correct it. How did it happen that all of psychology practically settled in on these concepts and methods that blur the individual journeys? So if you push the reset button and you think multidimensional, multi-level, at every level you talk about, you need to model it, you need to measure it. Don't measure it through the filter of psychometrics. No, measure it as directly as you can. Behavioral, if you can get it. Self-report, okay. Don't worry about the scales and comparing between people. Just measure it the best you can. Model it as part of a complex system evolving over time that's multi-level. We can do this in dynamical systems models, and we're learning how to do it. But boy, do we have a lot of bad ideas to undo. And the title of this, Evolving the Future Towards a Science of Intentional Change. Here's the problem. We don't get that full science of intentional change despite all these spectacular successes. The Good Behavior Game Act has had a wonderful run, continues, etc. We don't really get an answer to that when we grab just a partial answer and then ignore the rest. We're doing the functional equivalent of, high energy nuclear physics or something. It's incredibly complex, but we can do it if we take that evolutionary idea of variation, selection, retention, and context and model
At the
all
individual.
these different levels.
All these different levels.
So
Yeah.
are you honing in on what you're saying is there are different strands for different people in the self-help thing. Are you honing in on what's going on with
Yes,
this
indeed.
strand?
Yes, indeed. We're finding it's an exciting thing. I won't even unpack it but it's exciting that when you look for, well, then why are there people varying so much? We're finding clusters. I use the example of Horton Hears a Who. You have these statistical big ears, and suddenly here are these little clusters of folks who behave differently, but you don't see them if you do the randomized trials and all of that. You only
But
see
they
them if
but
you
they behave
model it
similarly.
idiographically first and then collected into nomothetic principles.
Have you got a
Reinforcement,
paper? Have you
you
got
know.
published something on that?
Yeah, some of it's just about to be published. It's a little head. That one piece is published of that, and now we've replicated it. We were just over the moon when
Could
he
you
did.
send that to me?
I will. But let me come back to you, David, because I want to say something. Let's take the CDPs. You're working with an organization.
And not just for our audience, the core design principle as well in our
The
rostrum.
core design principles, or if you're interested in psychological flexibility, our 6 principles, we should put, and it depends after every statement we make, because it's contextual externally, it's contextual in terms of level, but it's also contextual in terms of how these fit together. So you take one CDP, like agreeing on how we're going to make decisions, you plop that into a system, you can have the whole thing blow up because maybe that leader, let's say, or that method, you say, has now interacted with these other things at the level of the core design principles, but also maybe down at the level of the individual benefits that we can model with something like psychological flexibility, and all the way down to what maybe is going on in our vagal system or in our brain circuits or epigenetically, because we know all these things interact, and the thing may blow up on you. Yes, at the big level, you can win a Nobel for it. But when you're going one at a time and you're trying to actually change, this is
Well,
towards
so yeah, but I think that this gets from
change. It'll
this
blow up.
passage from generality to specificity. I think what I will be prepared to defend is that in functional terms, these core design principles are very general. We have good evidence for that. You know, if a group doesn't have a strong sense of identity and purpose, it's not going to function very well as a group. If decision making isn't fairly inclusive, then and so on and so forth. So
Yeah,
those are functional generalities.
flexibility.
Now,
Same
every implementation is likely to be different. So the rich context comes in, and how these principles are implemented is the way that I would put it. But
Could I correct it just a little bit and see?
sure.
Because yeah, it's implementing, and yeah, at the end, probably all these things fit together that make good sense that they fit together. You think about them evolutionary. That you've wrote a paper with Lynn Ostrom about just that. I do the same thing with psychological flexibility principles. But when you think in a multi-dimensional, multi-level way, you have to be open to the possibility that some of these things can't even be deployed until all the other things are together.
Sure.
It won't fit. It won't work. It has to work well, where are the statistical and measurement and research models that allow us to detect that? And if we're going to create a science of intentional change that expands over the umbrella of evolutionary science, we got to up our game. And I'm excited by the progress we're making. And yes, evolutionary thinking will be, I think, the umbrella. But boy, do we have a lot of work to do.
Yep. I think it's encouraging. This will be my final word, and then I'll have a final word. But my final word is just to note how seamlessly we have been discussing everything from educational programs for first graders to the worldwide economy to all this wonderful psychology stuff, seamlessly integrating these topic domains that for most other people are worlds apart from each other. So there's a demonstration basically for the generality of these ideas. And so that'll be my final word. And that's just Tony, Dennis, and Steve. That's Tony. What are your final words?
Well, I guess the question is, what kind of the jacket in your novel, right? the movement starts and the whole world is going to change, and they got jackets, they got a logo, and so on. And what is our logo? What's the social movement that could bring about the changes that we really haven't touched on? And the number one is climate change. And I met Bill McKibben fairly recently at ABAI. Do you know who Bill McKibben is?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're the second person I found. Went
Well,
to SPR right after.
tell him to say,
Bill McKibben is probably the leading person in efforts to try and reduce fossil fuel use. And he was arrested just last week about that. I mean, this and it's, if you've seen the movie Don't Look Up, that's where everybody is. They don't even want to hear about it, and it's understandable. But we need a social movement. But I think that it may be more important to get people to come together around values having to do with the well-being of the people around them. And certainly, ACT has done a wonderful job, and Dennis is doing a wonderful job. You're doing that with the pro-social and so on. We need a social movement because we are still massively in the minority. And I don't think about it so much in terms of everybody having a jacket that says evolution. I think of it as having a jacket that says, I cared for someone. I care for people.
Well, also an ultimately whole earth focus. Basically, this is fundamentally, this has to be a whole earth ethic. First and foremost, I am a human being and citizen of the world is the way I put it. That's the movement, I think, is, and that did not mention evolution. First and foremost, I'm a human being and citizen of the world, and acting on behalf of the rest of life, in addition to humanity, is the CDP1, the sense of identity and purpose that we need, and everything else has to be coordinated with that. Is the way that I would put it. That's great. So there's our social movement. Dennis, final words. Well,
I've been thinking about. I've had 4 existential events in my life of spiritual nature, and this work with the kids is a major piece of this. We have a laboratory in Ohio that is very interesting. We have 86 counties. They're small counties. That's good. And now there's dose response for good behavior game, for PAX tools, and other things. And we already know from our past work at Hopkins that there are changes in epigenetic expression as a consequence of 1 year of exposure to the good behavior game. And God knows what else had besides BDNF. I have no idea what that might be, but I do know that BDNF is very related to these social issues.
For our audience down at BDF,
a brain-derived neurotropic factor.
Thank you.
And the simplicity, if we go back to our essential humanity of being gatherers, hunters, etc., we were in small groups working together. And if we didn't work together, our group was going to fall and somebody else was going to eat us. It could be a 4-legged one and it could be a 2-legged version. So this is an essential mechanism that we have to figure out how to do these things at a longitudinal model, because it begins at the base of birth and all the things that happen in the early years, through school years, and on through adulthood. And we've got data now well into age 35, and we're finding out what is happening to those kids who went through the good behavior game, their kids. So I think this is an opportunity to do some good science, but it has to be bigger than me, because I'm 75 and, at some point there's a termination.
The state level, the fact that you can do good science at the state level,
yes.
Amazing. And so again, there's quite a few of those hiding in plain sight. And this is one of them. But Steve, you get the final word.
Well, you should take the final, David. But I think it's time for evolutionary folks to think in this multidimensional, multi-level way that's part of the tradition of evolutionary science back to Darwin. You know, it's there. We need to, we brought it out, and you can see the advantage of it. But it's a time to link it again to applied evolutionary science. Yes, there was a bad start out of the gate, a really bad one, because evolutionary science wasn't ready for it. And all of those criticisms of our article, the worrying of who's going to control the controller, and I lived through that with the Skinnerian thing as well. The answer is all of us. The people that we're working with need to be brought into the whole Earth orientation. But I don't think we have to necessarily do it in the way of we're going to train everybody to be an evolutionist. What we need to do is put into the wild some of these sensitivities to multi-level, multi-dimensional ways of thinking about things, watching out for selfishness at every single level, modeling over time, and doing it in ways that where measures are concrete, and give people the tools so that if you want to develop a public policy, if you want to have a better relationship, or if you want to have more peace of mind of purpose, or you want to not die an early death, you know, all of these levels can be served because we have gigantic amount of money going into health and human development and yoga classes and education. And just look at how much we're spending badly on what it is that we're trying to do, because we're not guided by a model of humanity, of life itself, that is viable scientifically. And so in addition to the technologies and programs and so forth, I hope that one of the things that people will see in our article was the attempt to go to the meta level and say that there is an umbrella here and we can develop it. And I think we were wise to bring in applied evolutionists. Run for the hills when you say applied evolutionary science. Wonderful evolutionists. I'm not going to name names, but you know what I'm talking about. So they run for the hills because they're frightened that if they ever held to account of changing anything, oh my God, they might make a mistake and people are going to, come on. That's what we have to put into the world. And so let's be humble about our individual achievements, but be bold about the capacity of us as a human population to take really good ideas, link it to ways of measuring so that that evolutionary process of variation selection can operate on us as policymakers and program developers and as individuals who are seeking out peace of mind and purpose. That's
well, Steve, that is the final word. I can't improve upon that. So I think we will make that the final word. And I'm so happy that we had this time to celebrate the 10th anniversary and to really point the way forward. So thank you to all of you.
Wonderful.
Thanks
to
for
be
organizing this.
Among the four horsemen again. That's fun.
I hope it's not the apocalypse.
Yeah, maybe not the best metaphor.
Okay.